Thank you, everyone, for just listening to me while I talk. I'm happy to be here since I think that I'm going to learn a lot of stuff. But for now, I'm going to talk about my topic, which is the transition from data and user to text and artist, based on some of the operations I have carried out in my research at ANGAR, which is an art and technology research and production center in Barcelona. The research, which I called at the beginning Formas de Matar el Mundo, How to Kill the World in Spanish, sought and seeks to examine, overturn, and play with the political consistency of virtual reality. I wanted, in a way, to give an outlet to a saying of Landon Winner in his classic book on the philosophy of technology, The Whale and the Reactor, and this is his question. An era of high technology should ask itself, what forms of technology are compatible with the kind of society we want to build? I have tried to answer this question by looking in particular at the cultural history and memory of forms of technology that are, in principle, incompatible with the kind of society some of us want to build, namely those of this society in which we live, a society in which we offer our data in exchange for free services, in which platforms are designed to foster habits that are toxic and quasi-psychopathological to human life, in which an ethics of privacy and a culture of the atomized, connected individual has been established, and which ultimately is making life on Earth and its ecosystems unsustainable. These are forms of technology that nevertheless are hiding among their ruins historically valuable stuff, like utopias and emancipations or processes of self-education previously unknown, and also loves, friendships, and intellectual accomplishments of all kinds. And even looking at the digital ruins where there are no such positive narratives, there is still a need for critical inquiry. There are, for example, some sinister facts typical of turbocapitalism that we need to take care of from a historical, memory, and cultural point of view. My project then departs from the historical method to understand and displace the synchronic consistency of social networking to a present past. This is a term of the historian Reinhard Koselleck, in which platform capitalism can be disentangled. When I speak of synchronic consistency, I am referring to what the After Memory Research Group at the Karlsruhe University of Arts and Design has identified as a sensorial expansion of the present arising from information and image overload. This quasi-metaphysical expansion of culture into a permanent and accumulating synchronic reality would have, as I say, negatively impacted our ability to make narratives by fusing ephemerality and eternity. They go on to say that the collapse of past, present, and future into a perpetual now, as it manifests itself in endless social media feeds, the looped temporality of gifts, and the extended self, needs to be addressed. The fleeting nature of image and information flows on digital platforms is countered by instant archiving processes that promise to retrieve anything and anyone from seemingly inexhaustible storage spaces, not least by means of tracking and surveillance. End of quote. So I have tried to look at the facts of the digital society of the present past with the tools of analysis of the discipline of cultural history and microhistory, understanding that in resorting to them, there was a political and methodological statement with, indeed, a creative, ecological, and generative force. Using the historical lens to examine the present could, as I saw it, provide our social ecologies with a temporal consistency that this time is intelligible to the human species, namely one that could make memories. So in this scenario, the first thing I did was to consider the archive. Most existing critical studies of digital culture do not depart from a consistent archival perspective when it relates to social media. Some of them have incorporated ethnographic corpora, but they usually lack a historical dimension. So as a cultural and literary historian myself, my work prior to this research usually started from being able to identify the archives and libraries where the objects that I wanted to analyze were located, out of which I could make sense of a moment, a scene, a network of an era. However, when I try to historically analyze the digital culture of the 21st century, as it refers to materials that were not explicitly created as artworks, I could not find those archives. And when I wanted to use anything that the internet itself gave me, there seemed to be privacy issues involved, and also, once again, a historical dimension many times lacking. So certainly, as the historian Niels Brugger has said in his book, The Archived Web, the digital world poses a challenge to the methodological traditions of primary bibliographic retrieval, and the case of instant messaging and, in general, interactions in social media is particularly complicated. Several national libraries already maintain by now a digital archive of websites and items pertaining to their cultures, and some of them even have, for example, collections of memes, and even one, the National Library of New Zealand, has what they call their own Facebook archive. But excluding this latter example, social networks have not generally been archived, and they actually are, on the contrary, perceived as de facto archives. So the very archiving of social networking materials, this gesture, when taking place outside of the platforms, needs, in fact, to take place within the lines of a legality and against the ownership clauses of the terms of service, which are, as we know, arranged against the idea that data could belong to their writers and be something different than data. So all of this landscape has pushed me to methodological experiments which intersect the fields of cultural history, literary theory, and archival science with the practices of art. And the first obstacle being a matter of archiving, I have devoted most of my time to imagining the creation of an archive of social networks and instant messaging, an archive of what in the history discipline would belong to what I sometimes research, and is called the history of written culture, in this case, transmedia. And this is a field that, to sum up, contemplates their cultural and aesthetic value in acts of writing that may not have been conceived as artworks to be sold or commissioned, and a field that I use to conceptualize that since art is contextual, textual or verbal art might take place in parts of the reality alien to the art or literary markets. And since data are quasi-infinite, one key problem of archives of born digital materials is being able to develop suggestive and environmentally coherent selection criteria. That is, the opposite of what we find in the endless development of data centers and artificial intelligence. An archive containing all of the epochal materials of social networks that can be called data would not only be impossible to organize, but is also not feasible from the point of view of historical memory. While data centers seek to sustain a business, the idea behind born digital archives, however, should be related to heritage and memory, sustaining what were cultural, intellectual, or otherwise artistic foci. For example, Richard Rorty's lectures or old net artworks, but also, potentially, the cultural and vital worlds that have taken place in private social networks. When I decided to start, after all of this, an archive of social networking materials that would precede their abandonment, that would prepare us for their abandonment, I started first from my own historical materials. I tried to reopen my old social network profiles and see what worlds I could compose with them. And what happened was that I found fragmented worlds that generally bore little resemblance to what I thought I remembered or what I thought I had there. And if undoubtedly a key aspect of digital dismemory has to do with the absence of a complex spatiality in digital experiences, among other nuances. On the other hand, I found that what I got back from platforms like Facebook or Instagram were clear design decisions to deliver materials that did not reproduce a memorable communicative scheme, in contrast to what these platforms automatize as memories. So the zip file that one received from Meta after asking for one's profile to be retrieved is a mess of torn apart messages and pictures, no longer intermediate most of the times, and incomplete past interactions where many times you don't know who you were talking to. In summary, the archive that you receive leaves your data self converted into a kind of footprint, a kind of ghost, somehow alien to what you see if you keep using the platform. At this point, the ideas of algorithm of late capitalism helped me a lot, as they are shown in the issue number 10 of their magazine, where we see on the cover a tree with different digital materials growing from its leaves in a landscape in which there are two people observing it and taking care of nature while reading. And there in the section, which is called Planting the Seed, the writers say, I'm quoting and reading from there, what would a different data infrastructure look like if we treated data like seeds planted in a garden? When gardening, we select specific seeds for a reason, carefully plant them, nurture them throughout their lifespan. Perhaps we are planting seeds to produce sustenance for ourselves or our communities, or perhaps they are flowers that beautify the neighborhood and provide nectar for bees. The metaphor of making a garden out of data was a guide for the continuing of my project. And as I started to think of the unreadable ruins recovered from my accounts as a long-term caring project of what social media platforms neglected. As Jonathan Crary has pointed out in his essay, Scorched Earth, we currently live surrounded by superfluous evils, forms of suffering that, quote, could be prevented but that persist by design or neglect. The way that I chose to prevent the superfluous evilness of social media was to turn data into memory-carrying experiences. As Walter Benjamin would say in Excavation and Memory, he who seeks to approach his own buried past must conduct himself or themselves like a man digging. Above all, he must not be afraid to return again and again to the same matter, to scatter it as one scatters earth, to turn it over as one turns over soil. For the matter itself is no more than the strata which yield their long sad secrets only to the most meticulous investigation. So digging, scattering, and raising a data garden out of the ruins of the very large part of our lives that took place digitally is a challenge of quite technical complexity for someone like me, not completely literate in IT, and one that also raises many questions about the cultural design of memory and experiences in the context of the so-called UX design. And I'm still trying out different ways of organizing, creating, and appreciating textual massive runs. But all in all, by converting our data into memory experiences though, and eluding the dizziness of digital overload, I think there is a chance we give a meaningful social resignification to our virtual past. So from the moment one begins to examine the philosophical and cultural status of technologies, the question of politics is noted as a key issue in a specific relation to design. So Langdon Winner, back in 1988, summed it up mentioning that the critical study of infrastructure is important, but it is no less important the study of the production of psychological, social, and political conditions that take part in any significant technical change. Winner wondered if we were going to design and build circumstances that enhance the possibilities for the growth of human freedom, sociability, intelligence, creativity, and self-government, or if we were going to do something else. It is actually unclear what we did thinking through this binary. The user experience orientation of app and digital platform cultures and their implicit aim of encouraging the conversion of human subjectivity into a smooth journey of consumption is less evil itself than the explicitly life-embodied destroying brutalities of racism or imperialist wars. However, given that it shapes political action, it is necessary to attend to what Crary identifies as a weakened ability to respond to others, absorbed as we are by the meager compensations of digital insularity. Transforming what the Institute for Technology in the Public Interest has denounced as the rigidification of the material conditions of the possible and the continued imposition of extractivist technologies of mediation on institutional logic to what I am researching, which is more related to the axis of the intimate, we find that in our interactions, the adoption of technology as a supposedly neutral zone of contemporary sociability reveals as a continuous creation of new and saturating protocols and modes of interacting that usually result in a growing anxiousness in our conversational modes and in general in a transformation of the ability of our communities to take responsibility for interactional cultures in terms that are sovereign. Our data shadow, following Jane Bennett's theory of the vitality of things, vitally vibrates with us. That is, it determines the future that we are yet to be. It is an accent on humanity, and it culturalizes us as an assemblage without sovereignty. In their research, Nick Couldry and Ulises Ali Mejias have signaled that a broader framework is needed to make sense of the digital social process underway, and that this framework would be colonialism. They point out that the appropriation of our data by corporation does not simply refer to the harvesting of an abundant and natural resource, but implies the complete co-optation of ways of living. So it is not that the data is there to be taken, it is that our lives are modified to generate the very resource. So platforms produce the social for the capital, namely a version of the social that is ripe for appropriation of value in the form of data. This is what they call data colonialism. From the point of view of them, in this sense, the world we are building so that data are generated technologically predisposes to the production of toxic psychosocial conditions among citizens. Social codependence is recomposed, as Eric Sadin, a French writer, has announced, around an isolated self, which is atomized from the commons and vitally dependent on the validation mechanisms of the machine. And as far as the historical is concerned, Facebook's promotion of the memorable and Instagram's Throwback Thursdays take the place of memory. As Jacobsen and Beer have remarked, the algorithmic automation operations of memory have progressively made their way into our assemblages as a passive substitute of our active digging in the past. In the book Childhood and Experience, Giorgio Agamben, already by 1979, depicts the problem of the end of experience that takes place in an automated world. Basically he says that within the overwhelm of multiple set choices, nothing can be experienced. For everything is based on certainties of design and technology. And this would correspond to the kind of experience that Benjamin called Erlebnis, which, as opposed to Erfahrung, which is an authentic experience grounded in the memory of a cultural and historical tradition, would be, Erlebnis, I mean, ingrained in the individual and often tied to the shocks of modern life. So the contemporary automatized version of Erlebnis, although numerically successful, has been perceived as improper to the human species by many, with an important number of popular titles about digital detox being published and highlighted right now at bookstores. Although all these popular readings have both their strategic value and their ideological flaws, something that crosses them is the overlooking of a question that is important for my research, which is, if we really should abolish the toxic technological sociability that dominates contemporary life, what shall we do with the stacked past of all these years? How to manage the memory of political violence, of data colonialism, and all the cracks of joy that its worlds have also contained. To answer these questions, I tried to opt for methodologies as practical as possible that could point to useful pathways, being consistent, I hope, with the commitment to imagine a possible future life after the decline of social networks. In this regard, there is a text by the Spanish researcher Rafael Sánchez Mateos, in which the politics of memory of artistic exhibitions in Spain is contrasted with the knowledge about peace processes in war conflicts. He reflects on the possibility of making memory works, either artistic or curatorial, that recall the violence of the past from within an ethical matrix associated with peace. So he says, I'm reading out loud here. There is a duty of memory and there is a pleasure of memory. If the memory of the past closes our access to the second, because in it we only find horror and death, there will be no peace in our present, and even less in the future. There is no doubt that it is important, especially when it is still denied, to dwell on the horror suffered by the victims. But it is necessary to dwell on it, not to show a grimace of war, but to take from it the energy to continue its flight towards a horizon of peace. This horizon is not detached from the reality in which the horror takes place, but has its strength in the humanity that permeates it. So back to the idea of archiving life in social networks, it is this energy that data gardens should be focused on, working both for the abolition of the sociability of the corporate and for the recognition of its past vitality. With all this conceptualization behind, I articulated two public calls with the aim of A, analyzing the cracks through which a piece of data legally could become a work of memory, and B, once this issue was integrated, to invite the community to donate fragments of social digital textualities to the archive that I've been creating. So this is the first of the two things that I've mentioned, which is a workshop that I called User Experience Social Network Archiving Workshop. And it was held last July, and it had as its background the question of how to make this moment, like this long-term digital moment, intelligible, focusing on generating memory works rescued from the toxic behavioral patterns of contemporary social networks. And basically, each participant brought materials of their own choice, and from these materials, we did creative or uncreative, however you might call it, activity. The underlying instruction was to carry out an active and involved work with our data in order to reconstruct what seemed for everyone differently a key aspect of the digital past, a brief selection of fragments to be remembered. These memory operations potentially could both A, counteract the heritage losses inherent to our techno-dependence on social platforms as de facto archives, and B, serve as a model for a political ecology of memory alien to the beliefs of the Anthropocene proper to most archival initiatives. The question of what counts as data and what might count as text, item, document, or artwork is key to what I want to recount at this point. The confronting paradigms of intellectual property and data protection laws. So when the EU General Data Protection Regulation came out in 2018, different bodies and associations related to archiving tried to offer guidelines to help us identify what counted as data in the context of institutions dedicated to safeguarding the works, different artworks or documents according to the principles of historical heritage. So together with Belén Soto, I made an examination of the tensions between the scopes of application of the data protection law and the scopes of applications of the intellectual property law from the point of view of literature and the arts. And I want to share in the screen a case model related to the potential inclusion of Twitter or X materials in a publication funded by a museum. This is the summary of what a lawyer could say to you in 2024, like following both two routes. The first one related to data protection and the second one to intellectual property. So if we start with the first option, according to what we have been able to review, there are several screenshots of comments made by users. In these screenshots, it is possible to see the user's nickname. It should be noted that data protection regulations are applicable to the processing of any personal data that can be identifiable. Therefore, as users' nicknames remain, they are identifiable. And for this reason, in order for our institution to be able to process the personal data and publish it, the consent is necessary. As we understand that this will be difficult, we recommend anonymizing. This is the first route. Then, in the second option, the lawyer thinks from the intellectual property law. And they would say, in general terms, we understand that we would be legitimized to make use of the captures as long as they appear as quotations. So the inclusion of fragments is legal, but it will be necessary to identify the author, and it would need to be published works. This is like ambiguous in the digital world, but this is a route that we can follow when this happens. So in both routes, the lawyer would have to add a relevant information, which is that there is a small risk regarding the terms and conditions of the social network, as this claim to not allow us to make any copy of the content. This is illegal in many countries, but this is also true if we analyze the terms. So the data protection law, in principle designed to protect the design of European citizens, exhibits, though, a normalization of the extractivist status quo proposed by digital corporations. And on the other hand, intellectual property laws, which, as it has been said, artificially restrict the experiences of knowledge. In this context, they seem to be the best tool against the current datification of life. So in the user workshop, which was just like an experiment with all of this, we opted out for the second road, understanding that transforming the rules of our data into ideas for making memory works somehow allowed us to expropriate those data from platforms and create peaceful revisions of the past. Having done this experiment and having tested the responsiveness of the participating group about working collectively with this kind of materials, I have recently started to circulate a call for the donation of instant messaging items. This call, by the way, is open and you can all participate if you want. So the best way to see what my archive and the call is all about, I think, is reading part of its announcement, which I translated for this presentation. One sec. So a popular archive for the decline of social networks has the social mission of making more livable the transition to a scenario for the expiration of the current techno-dependencies of our sociability, the economy of platforms and its ways of organizing the human experience. Most of the design decisions I made for the archive depart from the already narrated steps of my research and can be summed up in some key points. For now, it is focused on instant messaging for technical reasons. It will be secret until instant messaging apps cease to occupy the hegemonic position in the management of intimate and text-affective communication. It wants to take care of our heritage by generating a collection of what life has been like between 2012 and 2024. It seeks donations, but it does not seek to make effective use of them, and it will not be publicly accessible until the year 2150, unless agreed. So one of the main difficulties I face is when conceiving a method to collect items through donations had to do with privacy, and particularly, I believe, with the idea of privacy that is dominant these days. in a context where verbal, textual, and discursive commons are less and less present. As Jonathan Crary has pointed out, the intensifying of our anxiety about online privacy only deepens our investment in the logic of social separation and in the premises of cybersecurity. So I think that the perception of human interactions as a threat to our digital data bubble is too common, and people get anxious about unannounced communications, and it is common to have an internalized zero interpersonal trust policy. This is going mainstream, so consequently, at the time of constituting an archive, I had to commit myself to the privacy of the materials collected until the year 2150, which is just a rough calculation of the years of death of the potentially youngest donors. And I added to this hypothetical date a number close to the 70 years of rights that is typical of intellectual property laws in Spain. So even after having generated this type of clauses in a donation agreement, it is plausible, and it was something that happened, to find answers to the call that have reservations or that allude to not being good contributors to this project, or to not knowing if they like the idea of sharing chats, or that they say it all seems a bit strange. These answers are plausible even from historians, even though I've explained that I see this archive as a sort of epistolary preservation operation that adjusts itself to the technical particularities of digital affectivities. So luckily not all the responses have been like that, and I am already receiving some donations. And along these lines, one of the questions that I wanted to leave open to dialogue and suggestions has to do with how to proceed with preservation once I have a collection that can be called a collection. So what archival filters could be suitable for the care of this collection, thinking of its survival beyond the compiler's body, that is me. I would like to think of European alternatives to archive.org, for example, but also explore archival initiatives that have analog plans and contemplate post-digital futures. So the next steps of my research will continue, have not yet taken place, but will continue with two more public initiatives. First, a more advanced hands-on series of workshops about the political ecology of digital memory and the construction of a sovereign virtual past. I am preparing this series together with Victor Fancelli Capdevila, which is part of the mentioned Karlsruhe After Memory Research Group. We thought that a possible conclusive gesture of our experiments in this series, one that emerges after the experimentation with digital mourning and the democratization of the principle of curatorial selection, is working with voice and commemoration. Since voice is the most humble technique that communities have used in the past to preserve their histories and create common narratives, I think it would be interesting to go back to it after all the textual endeavors of digital data. And in this sense, I also leave open another question which is much more imprecise, and that is, what is the promise of the voice of the humble techniques of vocality in relation to their power of memory and in relation to the future communitarian synthesis of our digital present past? And the other initiative that I am currently developing is the creation of a small, what I called digital abandonment epistolary lab, where a small set of people commit to different techniques of going off social media and develop epistolary reflexive exercises while doing the process. The main question on this side has to do with the transition from the ethics and writing habits of the user to the ethics and writing habits of the writer of the past, and tries to think about how the design of writing environments conditions the forms of writing. Also examining the effects that the constraint of non-immediacy, what we would feel as a constraint right now, generates on the synchronic expectations of citizens. But in any case, I am still preparing this initiative, and this is the end of my presentation, and I am hopeful, and we'll be grateful for any feedback you may want to offer. So thank you for your attention.